and Good Daily Podcast. It's Thursday, a day where we get to collect the great ideas happening in our society and our world and bring them to you as a way to call you to pay attention to what's happening in our world with open eyes and with a hope-filled heart as we pursue the common good for all of us. And I'll tell you, I am thrilled today to be talking with Bruce Reyes-Chow. Bruce is the author of a new book, which you're going to adore, In Defense of Kindness, Why It Matters, How It Changes Our Lives, and How It Can Save the World. A bold statement and a fantastic book. So I am here in Minneapolis. Bruce, you're out in San Francisco, Oakland?
Well, I was in San Francisco for 30 years, but I've recently relocated to Palo Alto, about 40 miles south. So I've been here about 2 years now.
Sure. Great. Well,
Yeah.
and I am sitting down here in Minneapolis. It looks like you're sitting down as well.
I am. I'm in my pulpit / office / everything these days, right?
I hear you. Some days I like to stand up, and when I do, I brag that I'm standing up because smoking or sitting is the new smoking. So, but I am sitting down again today, and that's mostly because I didn't have a chance to change my setup in time to stand up. So let us know in the chat if you're watching on any of the socials where you are and what it is that you're doing, because we'd love to hear from you. Okay, Bruce, you've done it again as a prolific author and as a person of great leadership. You produced this book, In Defense of Kindness, and it seems like there's hardly anything as important in our world that we live in right now as finding a new way forward in a way that's kind. But I'll tell you, a lot of times, so many of us feel like this is no time for kindness. This is a time for bold justice, for bold action, for moving this country ahead. Talk to us a bit about why you're why you're a recruiter of kindness and a kindness evangelist.
I think there's one of my friends said on the Twitters, I don't want to read your book because it might change the way I may have to behave. And because I think what's happened is we have distorted kindness and we've made it weak and soft, and we've almost created a situation where kindness is no longer what I think it is or the power that it has. And so, folks who know me, I think we're like, this is really interesting that Bruce is going to come out with a book that's just going to tell us to be nice. And I'm like, well, do you think that's what I'm saying? Like, do you think that's what I would do?
Yeah.
And because I really try to flip it on its head to talk about the strength and power of kindness and social movements. And I do a whole chapter on protest and social justice and saviorism and really trying to kind of combat this kindness industrial complex where it's really can be more about just be quiet, don't rock the boat, avoid conflict. And that's not what I'm talking about at all. And I think if I can get people over the hump to read it. So, I had the people that endorse this book come out of social justice movements who I had to convince them, like, can you just take a read? Can you just take a read? I promise this is not everybody just say please and thank you and the world will be okay. Right. That's not at all what this is about. So what I'm hoping to do is just flip it on its head and see that the boldness and kindness are not mutually exclusive, but how we express those may look differently if we do it through a lens of how I'm defining kindness.
You've referred to yourself, I think I've seen on descriptions of you, that you're a kindness evangelist. Is that a fair phrase?
I think they chose enthusiast, kindness enthusiast.
Kindness enthusiast. You're enthusiastic. I mean, you're an enthusiast in temperament and spirit and personality. Why did you start writing this book? I know in the introduction you talk about how you set it aside for a bit and then came back to it, and you can tell us that story. But what was it about wanting to pursue this collective call to kindness that what got you there in the first place before you set it aside and came back to it? You can tell us that story too.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think part of it is that, my wife and I sat down and wrote a book for our kids that had 100+ things that we wanted to pass down from generation to generation, and everything from our favorite recipes to how do you go out and protest and every, sexuality, everything. We tried to cover the gamut. And in that, I think we ran into this exercise for both of us is like, what about ourselves and the world do we want our kids to and their friends and communities to live on? And how do we want to be not just seen as a performative space, but how do we want to be perceived and seen in the world? And I think for me, this has always been a tension with me in some of the spaces in which I move and live, and that sometimes I think we can revert to tearing each other down and dehumanizing each other in the name of justice. And I actually feel that that's detrimental to creating a larger movement. It may feel good and it may have short term kind of results, but at the end of the day, when we tear down the humanity of another person, then we're tearing our full humanity down. And I'm not okay with that. And I think it doesn't mean that I have to have coffee with every person I disagree with. I'm inviting him to my house and we're hanging out. Like I don't have to go to that extreme, but it does mean that I don't have to resort to misogyny and ableism and other things in order to challenge people. And I've always felt like especially in these last 4 or 5 years, as we moved into, it's politics has always been bad, but as we moved into a particular time and season, my friends and community have I think grabbed onto that even more so. And I do write a book on privilege, a chapter on privilege, and some other parts about how easy it is to do that. So that's what launched me into it. And I've always felt like people would say to me things like, "Well, you're too nice," or "You're being this," as 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 if being kind was bad, like as if
Yeah,
this was a
right.
negative. And
Right.
I'm like, I just feel like you're not hearing me. And so I started it. I got sucked into a lot of the stuff that was going on in politics and felt myself just, a part of me being eaten up by the not just the negativity, but the way we were dehumanizing each
Mhm.
other. And then I sat in this movie theater watching Mr. Rogers, who, Presbyterians, I come out of, that's my tradition. He's our patron saint of everything because he's our most famous Presbyterian ever. But, I'm watching this movie in this documentary about, the first episode of Mr. Rogers is about how King Friday wanted to build a wall around his kingdom, right? I
Yeah.
mean, right? And then he's sitting in a pool looking with Francoise talking about, race and I leaned over to my wife and I'm like, I think Mr. Rogers is a pain in the ass right now, and he's asking me to pick this back up. And then the next day, the publisher of Chow's Press emails me and says, "Hey, are you ready? Do you want to pick this book up again?" And
Yeah.
so that's how it started up. And 6, 7 months later, it was done, and we're now on this journey. And I feel really good about the project. I mean, it's hard to ask your friends to support something you're doing unless you really believe in it. And
Yeah.
I've like good speaking or good writing, if you're not converting yourself as you're doing some of it, why
Mhm.
are you doing it? And
Mhm.
so it's been a reminder to me to continue to think about kindness.
Well, I'm so glad you spent a lot of time thinking about kindness. I'm also a kindness advocate. I want to be kind, to self, to others, kind to God. Like it's like a version of love, right? And I'm glad you spent a lot of time thinking about it because I got a bunch of questions about kindness. If that's okay, if you will indulge me in some kindness questions. Um, Obviously, you've said that kindness is not in opposition to boldness. Okay, so fair enough. Uh, and so, Bruce, I'm wondering. I think maybe you've lost me a little bit on the audio because I could tell by reading your face.
Right. I'm having some technical difficulties on my side. Not sure what's
That's
going
okay.
on.
That's okay. I can hear you, and the whole world is going to hear you when this podcast gets out.
Okay, I got you now. I can
That's
hear
a
you now.
Bush. It's a Bush joke. So I was saying I'm so excited that you have written this book and spent a bunch of time thinking about kindness. One of the things that's the benefit to an author who writes on a topic, right? You just spend a lot of time thinking about it. And I have a whole bunch of questions about kindness that I'd love your thoughts on.
All right.
You're a kindness expert. You've already said that kindness is not boldness or is not the opposite of boldness.
Yeah.
And so I want you to say something, if you would, about how it's not niceness. Like I come
Mhm.
from the land where people accuse us of being Minnesota nice here, and they're like,
Yeah.
it's kind of the opposite of kindness. It's a veneer. I don't find that in Minnesotans, but other people certainly have that experience. And so I'd love for you to say something about that. But before that, maybe this notion that you just mentioned briefly there, that people talk about kindness as if it's a human quality, but a liability that we have to protect against lest we be taken advantage of or sort of waste
Yeah.
our life away being kind. Like, sure, it's in us, but don't be too, like as an adult, as a professional, as somebody in the world, Don't be too kind because somebody's out there to get you. And you might think they're coming in to embrace you with a hug, but they're going to stick you with a shiv. So
Yeah.
protect yourself and don't be overly kind, right? These are really competing ideas
Yeah.
that exist in the
Yeah.
world and people wonder about them. So can you talk a bit about that, about the role of kindness in humanity and how it's also not just what people might perceive as niceness?
Yeah. Yeah. My favorite sticker that's out there right now is do not mistake my kindness for weakness. Because I think that's what we often do. And I find it very interesting, this word kindness itself, because if you were to ask anybody who is raising children or child adjacent, and you said, do you want your child to be kind? I don't think anybody says, actually, no, I want them to be total jackasses all the time.
Yeah.
Like nobody, right? But yet we have that very same thing that you just mentioned, right? Oh, but kindness is actually bad because you'll get taken advantage of. I think if you believe that kindness, one, is a commodity and it's transactional and it's only one unidirectional, that it's only out towards someone and not towards yourself. And I think that if we simplify kindness in that way, in a negative way, where it's just be nice, don't let anybody just don't rock the boat, then yeah, that's not how I define kindness. How I define kindness is that we recognize that each person is created and complex, and then we treat them as if we believe that is true.
Wow.
And I think that if we believe that, then how can we, when we disagree with somebody vehemently, the editors really wanted me to soften my Trumpism stuff down a little bit because eventually the book is, we're gonna be like, who is that again, right? And it's like, I say at the beginning of this chapter, I don't want to devote so much time, and then I wrote a whole chapter on him. So, but I do think that, folks who know me, I there was very little, if anything, that I'd agreed with him about, and protested and was arrested and did all the things. But I would never seek to the ableism that people directed his way. I would never sink to some of the, the body shaming and things that folks did, because I know that part of when we do that, what we say to other people in the world is, oh, what we believe about people who are big. Here's what we believe about your mentality and your politics. And we're making those kinds of things. And so kindness is about recognizing, oh, wait, there's a complex created person there. I don't have to agree with them. I don't have to let things go. I don't have to, I can still speak out, but I don't have to sink to the level where I dismiss their humanity, because most of the time I'm not as funny or as witty as I think I am. And so, if I'm paid to be a satirist and paid to be a comedian, that's one thing, but most of us are not. Yeah. And so I think our well that we dig into is, how do we stand up against things that we disagree with without resorting to the same tactics that they very much we would say are wrong when they're directed towards us. And that, I think, is excruciatingly difficult. It's a choice we have to make every day. And it's, I think, something most of us don't want to do. It's just easier if we sink to that level. And so when I talk about being bold, I think there is some radicalness of not sinking to that and still being able to call people out. I think there's a radical nature. When I think about the kindness and boldness, there's nothing that exemplifies that more to me than civil disobedience, because you're standing in front of people, and I don't see these people as my enemies. I see them as human beings who have been put into a position by choice or circumstance. And now they're going to have to make a decision and a choice. And I'm recognizing that humanity as I kneel before them, ready to be thrown on the ground or arrested or cuffed or whatever. I don't see them as less than human. In fact, the way that I view them is filled with so much humanity that I'm challenging them to do the same to me. And I think those are those places where where I'm saying that if we can exhibit this more often, I choose to believe that overall the world will shift. Now, I know that's a huge, bold statement, but if you're going to write a book, you got to make a bold statement or two.
Why else?
Right? I mean, otherwise, why else would you do it? Well, it might be okay. It might work.
So
I just
obviously,
think there's too many options.
Yeah, you said it well. Obviously, it's something more than just not a veneer niceness. And kindness is also something different than the opposite of meanness, right? So if someone says, well, I wasn't mean, the beautiful thing about this book is you're actually calling people into kindness as its own way of being,
Mhm.
right? That it's not just the absence of something or supercharging something else. It's its own goodness. You tell the story in the book about if you saw even your great nemesis from your childhood, someone who you carry great resentment for, walking down the street and they have a sweet little puppy on a leash walking next to him, you'd be like, oh, that dog loves that person, because dogs have this kind of if a dog is being sweet to a person,
Yeah.
and not being aggressive, there's something that we recognize in that. That you raise up as, look, that there's a way of being kind that is not derivative of something else. Kindness is its own thing. Do I have that right? I
Yeah.
mean, am I
Yeah.
am I am I reading you
Yeah.
right?
Because I think what we've done, and I talked a little about this, is we've lowered the bar on so many things that just should
Mm,
be normal. Like I start that whole piece off talking about how I think we've lowered the bar on fatherhood. Like,
yeah.
you can show up wearing whatever you want, and you just have to pick a kid up from school, and there's like, oh, you're such a good dad. Like, well,
Mhm.
okay, right? I mean, we've just like, and I think some folks, thrive on that, the bare minimum, and then I get this credit for being this amazing person,
Nice.
whereas another person does, 10 times more, and they're like, oh, can't they do more? I think kindness, we've done that to kindness and made it so that it's kindness. All you have to do is
Mm,
not be a jerk and you're kind. I'm like,
nice.
well, that that is not enough. Or all you have to do is have one small gesture in a parking lot. This whole idea that one small good thing, and I'm not disparaging doing kind things in, holding the door open, but I think we've created this like, oh, if a black person and a white person and they're different ages and they do something nice for each other, we put that on YouTube. We're like, oh my gosh, look how amazing this was. And while it makes me sad that we believe that that's amazing, at the same time, I'm like, okay,
Mhm.
yes, great. But let's not make that the bar that we're trying to achieve.
Nice.
Let's
Mhm.
let's make the bar that we stop tearing each other down because we disagree politically. And so now all of a sudden you're no longer worthy of breath. Like you're no longer, like it just feels like we have again, I want kindness in the world, but I just don't want to do it. I mean, I think that's
Yeah.
where we really land, for too many of us do, at least.
And these political times that we're in have made it hard for a lot of people because their passions are raging. I spent 2 years
Oh
traveling
yeah.
the country trying to warn people about the what I saw as the dangers of Donald Trump, and I had to work up my own little routine on this, right? And I would say
Yeah.
publicly nearly every day that as a person, as a Christian, as a pastor, I truly believe that every human being is a beloved child of God, full of all the grace and love, and
Mhm.
nothing they can do to gain it or lose it. They're the light of the world and the salt of the earth. But not every light of the world should be the president of the United States. So we should
Yep.
let this guy let his little light shine somewhere else. I was trying to talk myself into and other people into holding something that
Yeah. The
was
question is, did you
uh,
believe it?
I was trying to believe it, right? Like a lot of great professions of faith, you're pulling yourself forward into the thing that you hope you will believe. I was trying to remind myself, yes, this person is a beloved child of God who deserves the kindness and of everyone else. But it doesn't mean he should be in the role he's in, and doesn't mean he should be doing what he's doing, and trying to hold those tensions.
Yep.
I think about your patron saint, Fred Rogers, who I think is famous for a quote that goes something like, "If you knew a person's entire story, you couldn't help but love them with your whole heart." Right? Sort of something you're getting at. Like, if you really humanized and knew, you could find that empathic connection that could lead to kindness. That's just really hard for human beings to do. So is kindness actually is it just built into some people and they're just more kind? It's just a temperament quality, or is it a practice that we can learn and that we can grow in, and that we should be putting forth like any other skill set that we're developing? Should we think about it as a skill, or just as a temperament pattern?
Yeah, I think it's both and. I mean, it's certainly some folks are wired differently than others in all ways. So I do think it is both and. But I want to go back. So I think one of the problems with Americans is we everything escalates and has to be these extreme either ors. So if I see somebody as a human being, that means that I'm okay with them coming over and having dinner with me. Well, I don't think that that's actually true. I can see somebody as a human being and
Nice.
detest their beliefs and not want them around my children and not like and part of that I think is understanding that kindness is not just one way, right? We have to exhibit kindness to
Mm,
ourselves. How do we see ourselves as complex, created, and believe that to be true? I read a chapter on my mother and her boldness and kindness to herself about leaving a stepfather whose name I did not change for the book at all. And I just kind of felt like, knowing everything, I'm grateful that my mother chose to be kind to herself.
mm,
I mean, I think that part of this is not this. I think we like this, this two-sided polemic all the time that you're
yeah.
either this or that, and most of life, as is lived in the in between. And so when we talk about seeing humanity, I think what a lot of folks like, well, if I see humanity, then I have to let them off the hook, or I
Hmm.
have to be nice
Hmm.
to them. I have to all. I'm like, I never say that. I'm like, no, actually, you still hold them accountable because you care about their humanity in many ways. So I think that is. But back to your the question at the end though about whether it's a practice or it's innate. I do think. I think I would love to consider myself that I have an innate kind of leaning towards kindness. That was my grandfather, who I talked about in the book, was
Yeah.
super kind. He didn't commodify his kindness, and some would say that he was taken advantage because of that. But I will always err on the side of being too kind than the other way. But at the same time, I think every day, like other things in my world and life, I have to choose to live differently. And I have to choose to see every interaction I have with every person, every creation, that created thing that I walk out and interact with every day. I have to see those interactions as ways to build people up or tear people down. I think there are very few
Mm.
neutral situations. As much as I just said, there's just not too polemic. I think there are very few neutral things. And so when we're standing in line at the coffee shop, you see the best and worst of people, right? School
Yeah.
drop off in coffee shops. I think you see how we're
And somehow Costco when you're in the paper
it
aisle,
got
and
it
it's
like
that's the
Costco,
start of a
right?
pandemic. Yeah.
Depending on how hungry people are. Yeah, I think there is, and so I have to choose not to be performative, but to remind myself that my interaction in that line, or when I used to have to drop my kids off or wherever I am, those interactions have impact. And those can either be about building up and acknowledging humanity or dismissing it and pretending it doesn't
Mm.
exist. And that's the practice and the habit that I think we have to choose to decide to do every day. So it's
Wow.
both innate and it's habitual.
Yeah. Not to keep us only in the political space, but I can't
Sure.
hear the word kind without hearkening back way to the early 90s when George H.W. Bush was the president. And we could, people our age will still chuckle at his
uh,
whole notion, right? That we want this to be a kinder and gentler
Gentler.
nation.
Yeah.
And that idea, and right, mocked for a generation
Yeah.
for that. Um, Even Mr. Rogers, as much as we sort of hail him,
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
sort of made fun of, picked on. Like there's something in us that just sees kindness in some way that we, like you've said so well, we want for our children, we honor in our parents and grandparents. But then there's this weird thing about like, well, don't let that become sort of your mode of operation, right?
Right. Yeah.
Don't be that. So, do you think that's is that just a societal problem, or is that is that part of the internal struggle that we all feel
I
with
think we've
being,
we've allowed the definition of kindness to just get usurped by this idea that it's bad. I had the privilege of getting to know Representative John Lewis and sat down with lunch and had
uh,
a few conversations with him. And um, it's difficult when you read a book about somebody and then you meet them and you hope that they're the same person that they're in their book that they are in person, right? I mean, you're like, oh gosh, I hope like. And he was just as gentle and kind in person, but he was not weak.
Yeah.
right? I mean, if anybody were to have met him when he was alive, I mean, I had two or three interactions that were poignant around him. You know, one was sitting at lunch right after um, uh, uh, Barack Obama was elected president, and I asked him, "So why'd you switch from Hillary?" I was like, "So how did that happen? Like, when did that?" And we just had these great
Hmm.
conversations, and his like, no one would ever say that he's weak,
Right.
right? But he was certainly kind. He never spoke ill of somebody's humanity. He certainly challenged people's belief systems and all those things. And
Hmm.
and then I ran into him on an airplane. Representative John Lewis in economy class, cramped into a middle seat, trying to eat his lunch without bothering his two seatmates on either side. And I'm like,
Mm.
this is Representative John Lewis.
Yeah.
Y'all get up and give him your seat. Like, but he was like, no. And it wasn't performative. I think
Yeah.
he recognized humans around him.
Mm.
And would anybody ever say something like that was weak? No. So I think we see it lived out in our politics, but we don't
Hmm.
name it as kindness. We don't see it as something, or we might say, oh, well, that's how so and so did it. Well, I mean, there's some power in the way that people have moved social movements. So I think we do see it. We just, like my friend said, it just changes the way we have to behave, and it is
Yeah.
harder. And there's not as much. It's in our social media world today. There's not as much juice that comes from it, and so I try not to retweet or reshare things that reinforce an unkind way of interacting, but
Yeah.
will for those things that I believe are putting a different vibe of challenge into the world.
Mm. Well, you should do a whole seminar on that, a little webinar on that sometime. I wonder if kindness actually requires strength, and one of the reasons that we don't pursue it as much in our society or individually is that we sort of lack the strength. I think about how physical trainers talk about people's bodies, and they'll say, like, look, you have really weak hamstrings, so what's happening is you're compensating in your back, and that's why you're having back pain, right?
Mm,
Because you have a weakness in an area, so another part of your body is holding you upright. And I wonder if that's a metaphor for the idea that, like, well, we do require a certain strength in order for kindness to be in place. And because people sense an internal or even a societal weakness, that's why we feel like, boy, we can't lean into this. So I wonder if they're like, when people are kind, thinking of you saying your grandfather or Representative John Lewis or Fred Rogers or others. My guess is that when you're around them, you're like, oh, this person has a unique level of like self-knowing and confidence and strength that maybe sort of builds on that. So maybe the way you become kind is like in a physical therapy situation where you train differently than what you think it is. So you don't strengthen your back, you work on strengthening your hamstrings, right? So that your
mhm.
back can have the pressure taken off. I wonder if this overly belated metaphor might be something that you've discovered as people pursue kindness, that you actually have to develop other qualities of the human spirit in order for kindness to be accessible to a person.
That's a really interesting metaphor. I'm gonna have to think about that. That's good.
Hmm.
I haven't really thought about it in that way, but I'm intrigued by that idea because in most of leadership in other places, I don't really believe in becoming well-rounded. I think we do have
Yeah.
some strengths and we kind of lean into those because we spend so much time dwelling on what we're weak at, that sometimes it takes away from other things. But in this case, I do think that kindness is whether we're trying to become well-rounded, it is a neglected muscle, and it
Hmm.
is a societal neglected muscle. So I don't even know if it's we all need to have it be strengthened as much as we just need to know we have the muscle and
Oh, yeah.
try it. Like I don't even know if we're at the point of going, oh, I wonder what hurts. I'm like, well, I think we got to acknowledge that it's there
Interesting.
before we even know. Give ourselves permission to unleash kindness before we decide even that it's weak. Maybe it's just that we
Yeah.
haven't even
Huh.
allowed ourselves or given ourselves permission to be kind and
Hmm.
to for some it may take a little bit longer to see how that benefits and creates a better spirit about ourselves. For others, it might be like,
Mm.
oh, that's what it feels like to not spew garbage into the atmosphere every
Right.
day. Like,
Interesting.
huh, how
Yeah.
refreshing if I don't fill my body up with whatever every day and I shift.
Yeah.
Oh, that might be different. Maybe I'll do that again. And then when I falter, I'll know that, but maybe I've known enough where I'll
Mm.
choose to do it again the next day. I mean, I think that's part of this journey, I think, is just acknowledging that I choose to believe we all have the capacity for kindness. So I'll
Yeah.
just say that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, whether
Look,
we've
and
exercised it or not.
yeah, now I'm thinking, boy, about the physios watching, and they might be saying, sometimes, and
You
I've
guys
been
don't know what you're
accused of
talking about.
this. I've been accused of this by my physical therapist, that my glutes don't engage, right? So I have them, but they just sit there. It's called lazy glute syndrome, or they call it lazy ass syndrome. So I do all these little exercises, like sitting on a hard bench and trying to make each glute sort of move, that you have to intentionally engage, because you develop patterns in your neuro pathways that just say fire this muscle, fire that muscle, and they're very unconscious. So you get into unconscious bad patterns, and then when you consciously engage that, you have to consciously engage it for a while so that it becomes unconscious again. And you can use it. And this is a lot of training that anybody's had knee surgery or hip surgery or shoulder surgery. This is what you do a lot of, right? You have to sit there and think, like, move that shoulder, don't use my back. That's almost what I hear you describing as something like, okay, you have it, and some conscious work, and your book has great tips and clues, might start to engage that area. And I also think back to this puppy thing. I know a lot of people who've gotten puppies, and they just say, like, it's just made me kinder. It's just made me caring for another living being and being snuggled by it and having to be so excited when and I'm not a dog person, so I can say this with full throated, like, and then, the dog comes home and excited, like, it just makes me softer and it makes me smile and it's made me a kinder person. I hear that all the time from dog people. So maybe that's what we need too, right? Is like to practice with some, in some spaces that really lead us home. Yeah.
We all develop, those mechanisms for ourselves. I often will say to myself in my own work, I'm actually not saving lives. So nothing is as urgent as I would like to pretend it is. And when I say that to myself, I can exhibit that to others who think everything else is urgent, or that I should be as urgent as they are. And but I say it out loud. If you were to come into a staff meeting, I almost every staff meeting, I remind our staff, we are not actually saving human lives in this office. People will be okay if you don't email them back in 10 minutes. I promise you, they will be okay.
Yeah.
So, and I know that is a mechanism that I use for myself, because I can easily slip into that. I have set up things in my own electronic world that allow me to not buy into urgency. And so I think when it comes to kindness, I will often, if I drive up and to somewhere and I see a line, I actually say things to myself like, it's okay, I'm not in a hurry. Like, I'm not. And if somebody else seems like they're in a hurry and not in a passive aggressive way, I will just say, hey, no, feel free, go ahead, it's okay. And not as oh, I see you're in a hurry. Like, I'm not trying to be snarky, but I'm like, and maybe that's a kindness that gets passed on, right? And I don't want to oversimplify this kind of pay it forward thing, but in the same way, I'm like, oh, when I'm in a restaurant and the service is awful, I remind myself, like, what else is going on in that person's world? One, I don't want to piss off my waiter, but two,
a little self-preservation there. Yeah,
it's self-preservation. But two, I'm like, what is happening in somebody's world that's exhibiting and living out in how they're operating right now. And that is a kindness. Again, I'm not asking them to come home for dinner. I'm not like trying to, like, it's just, I'm just trying to see the world a little differently and then act as if that matters.
Right. You don't go into the world thinking, let's make a buddy comedy today with every person that I interact with. But I do know people, and I've taken up a bit of a practice too, that I get a lot of these spam phone calls, and some reason my iPhone now tells me when it's a spam call and can't, like, not send it to my phone. It just says probably spam.
Yeah.
So I get those, and every now and again I see it and I think, there's somebody that's going to pick up on the other end of that after I pick up, right? Because it's a robocall,
Right.
and I'm just going to be nice to them and just say,
Yeah.
hey, thanks a lot, thanks for calling. Hope you're having a good day. And just try
I'm
to
not
like
interested.
practice random kindness
Yeah.
just because this person's either sitting at home on a call center screen or somewhere. And like, yes, it's irritating to me that they're calling me, but this is a tough job. And
Yeah.
just to take a moment and say, and maybe this is a middle-aged guy thing that we're living with, because just to like step back and be like, hey, I've run around acting like everything's urgent for 30 years and it really wasn't
Yeah.
urgent. I can take a minute here and just do
Yeah.
something kind. It's like these little kindness practices that are much more natural to some people. Like I have a snarky personality and I think things are funny, and I think I'm sort of more funny than other people think that I am. And so that can come across as acidic and not really kind. My wife Shelley's constantly saying to me like, hey, just be kind. Like, be, and it really is more hearty to be kind. It's just sort of more fun to be, I don't mean to be rude, but you know what I mean? To
Yeah.
sort of be
Yeah.
sassy or flippant or something. And so to make conscious choices like that is, yeah,
Yeah. And
that's
and I'm not like I am not the destroyer of all things fun. I mean, I think that part of it is that part of I we just have to
you can be
understand
kind and
context and
fun.
do the work to
Yeah.
read a room and to figure out where we are and to because I know that people, my family, people also known as my family, um, somebody will say something and part of it I'll get this look that's like, I'm in my own home. I can say
Hmm.
whatever the hell I want.
Hmm.
Like, I don't
Hmm.
have to be nice, kind, generous when I'm sitting at the couch yelling at my TV. And I'm like, that is true. That is the kindness for me is to know that we all need those spaces in which we are not, the kindness is about us needing to vent and to kind of let go versus what the world may see, because not everybody sees into our living room to see how we're
Hmm.
yelling at the TV. So I do think there's just nuance that I think we don't want to engage in, and so it's tiring. It's a lot of work to do,
Yeah.
but I choose to do it.
So the subtitle of the book is the title is "In Defense of Kindness," which is an interesting phrase. That it needs to be defended, and I think it does. But the subtitle is "Why It Matters, How It Changes Our Lives, and How It Can Save the World." Do you want to say a little bit about that? I mean,
Yeah,
granted, every author is not held to their title and subtitle, as some of us know. These get created in spaces that aren't always involving us.
exactly,
But there's
exactly.
something compelling about that idea that kindness can save the world. I know there's a lot of big programs going on and national efforts like the Kindness Project and other things that are like this. Do you want to talk a little bit about how it has transformative power to make a
Yeah,
difference in the world?
I mean, these are not again bold or new statements. I just think that if we can be kinder in our spaces, the power of social media and technology and the ways in which we interact now, I just think kindness is just as able to be spread as tearing each
Right.
other down and
Right.
dehumanizing each other. And so when I engage in disagreements with somebody and I model something that's a little differently that makes me feel good about the way I engage disagreement and feel I have some integrity about it, I hope that others would be able to see that and that might pebble out. When I know my children watch me and how I interact and they know me and is there consistency with what I say and how I expect them to be or have hoped them to be and then what I do out in the world. And I think the more of us that engage in that difficult work that is in some ways antithetical to selling books or getting a lot of followers or, you know, getting that blue check because we're not pissing off more people that you need to have be verified. Like all that stuff
Mm-hmm.
that I think has in many ways commodified our interactions and our relationships. The more of us to just let that piece go and see that the human interaction and acknowledgement of humanity in the other person is more important, I choose to believe that that spreads.
Mm.
And I mean, I've seen that in small circles. I've seen that as I've interacted in spaces like youth soccer and uh, my kids' schools and other places where This isn't just about spaces that theoretically are committed to a better world, in faith communities or in progressive spaces and all that. But these are like just regular old spaces where everybody gathers. And I do think it makes a difference. And so while you're right, I mean, these subtitles and titles always get, churned out in other spaces. I struggled with it when this was pitched to me. And I'm like, this feels really maybe too bold. Like, really? But at the same time, I do believe, if I don't believe that it actually could impact the world and me individually and the communities that I'm around, why am I writing it? Why am I putting these words and thoughts out into the world if I don't believe in them? So this one publication is obviously not going to do it, but maybe we can all take a few more steps towards it.
It does feel like there's a movement of kindness afoot, though. It really does. I mean, there's candy bars or health bars that carry the name, and there's books, and there's books with the kind bar. Back in the fall, we did a poll at Vote Common Good of faith voters, Christian faith voters, especially white evangelicals and white Catholics, who had moved away from supporting Donald Trump in 2016 and to not vote for him in 2020 or to vote for Joe Biden. And we wanted to know what in their Christian narrative was informing that shift. And we saw this percentage of them that were making this move and wanted to know what that was. So through the magic of statistics and polling and people who know all this stuff, we did this poll. And the thing that came out was that the number one reason a person moved from Trump to not supporting Trump or to supporting Joe Biden was if they saw Donald Trump as profoundly unkind, or if they saw Joe Biden as more kind. Like, you take away everything else, all the policies and everything, the part that motivated these faith voters was he's just too unkind. And so we started talking about this, and we did a whole press thing around it, and it got a lot of traffic, and we did it. And nearly every interview that I would do with someone, including, newspapers, CNN, all this, they would all say things like, yeah, but, like, kindness can't really be a governing philosophy or like a way forward. Like, sure, but let's get real here. What is the policy that's really going to drive these people? And I don't know. I just think for so many of us, while we bemoan kindness or we worry about it in ourselves, we're just attracted to people who demonstrate something that feels like they're more in touch with their full humanity, and kindness feels like one of those things. But it screams out within this stark contrast where people are like, that's not a way to run the world. Like, you're going to run the world, you're going to be in some other way. And I wonder if we're actually learning this. I wonder if this is part of the great awakening of the human spirit that's been happening for 50,000 years, and we're just getting to this one in a new way now. That care and kindness are part of this.
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. I think I'm not surprised at all. Like, okay, that's all well and good, but what's the thing? Because I do think there are people who've been in power who are genuinely kind people, right? Who I believe have to make difficult decisions, and kindness is also about understanding and acknowledging when you mess up, right? I mean, there's all this whole kindness thing is, again, it's not just be nice to people. And I think we just always, when we don't want to do it, that's what we default to.
Nice.
So we're just going to be nice. I'm like, I can't be held accountable for things I don't say. So I'm like, no, that's not what I mean. Right. So sometimes kindness is like, yeah, that was a mistake, and I shouldn't have done it. Nice. And, whatever. I mean, and I think a nation that understands kindness and acknowledges its past mistakes in ways that value humanity. And we have lots of places in our own U.S. spaces that are struggling with that now. And so I think that we can govern with a heart of kindness, as long as we don't believe kindness is weak and it's about being nice and avoiding conflict. Right. So if you can just send that on to the White House about my definition, and then we're good.
Yeah. I think there's I think some of that was just a real contrast, right? That there was sort of a general meanness that people felt out of the previous administration that people perceived as strength too, right? Is another thing that like you see this, that When someone's harsh and ruthless, they're like, oh, I'm even doing it right now, like crunching up
Yeah.
my face and clenching my fist and being harsh, and like I'm doing a strength pose. And then when I talk about kindness, like my eyebrows go
You
up and
open
my
up.
hand comes open and I'm all like one of those floppy
Yeah.
blow ups outside of a car dealership. And that's just this, we attach a certain narrative to all of this. Now, the Christian tradition, of which both you and I spend a lot of our time and are rooted in the Christian text, the book of Galatians has this great little string of admonitions for us, saying that the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Like, this is an ancient teaching too, right? That like kindness sits in there with goodness and with faithfulness and self-control. And it's interesting when you look at that list: faithfulness, or love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Some of those in our Christian traditions, people talk about a lot. I've been in talked about lots of, how do you have more joy? How do you pursue more love? How do you talk about self-control? Then other things get left off the list, right? Like gentleness and kindness.
Yeah.
And so there's
Well, I
something
think
even in our Christian tradition, we dodge it, even though
we do the same thing. Well, those are great, but don't run the church like that.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you got to be just as ruthless in faith circles. And I'm like, you do? Like, we're supposed to hold all these things in kind of tension and together. Like all of the things that our text kind of pokes into our world, things we disagree with and agree with. And like, how do you hold all of that and not just do the things that seem to benefit us, which I think mostly we want to hold on to the things that benefit us or preserve our privileged spaces or don't really create discomfort or disruption in our lives. Those are the things that when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, those are great. I love those.
Yeah.
But things that are going to disrupt the way that I exist in the world, because there's apparently some zero-sum game of compassion and joy and hope in the world, and I don't want to risk giving any of that up. I'm just going to ignore the things that will challenge that. So I think we do it in all walks of life.
That is so interesting, Bruce. It's just got me thinking now for the first time, looking at this list that involve these words: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Most of those could be pitched as just an internal state of being. Be full of joy, be full of patience, be full of love, be faithful. But kindness, that involves another. And I wonder if it isn't part of our spirituality, where we just do so much sort of thinking that our spirituality is to work on our own state of being, and we resist the ones that now get us into this relational obligation or relational necessity, or call it something. I don't know.
Well, and I think
fresh here.
I was going to say, I think those who kind of sit in this whatever you wanted liberal progressive space are so scared of being perceived as the other side of a version of our particular tradition that we don't want to be as pushy or being too vocal or too whatever. And I think, well, if that's how you're going to come across, then you need to do your thing differently. And so, because I've always been like, if we don't get I don't know how much we're talking about faith. If we don't get a gospel out there that is better than the other versions, then we've in some ways abdicated that space. And so I think you're right. I think it's easier if we just look internally. We're pretty good. We've been good for generations, and now we're saying we're not. And now we don't know what to do because we've forgotten that muscle of how do we actually express these things that are so important to us. How do we do that in a way that isn't just about be a good person? It's one that informs policy and the ways in which we govern and the ways in which we treat one another. I mean, I think that's where in some spaces, and I talk to my own progressive family in this regard, right, that we've lost the ability to speak this into the world with any conviction and just and passion. We've just kind of become apathetic, and we've abdicated that space to different versions.
There's a couple of people on the chat room in the chat. I do this every time. I call it a chat room for some reason. I've done it like for
I
the
do
last
too.
week,
I
like
do
it's
that too.
1997. I mean, my goodness, it's just unbelievable in the chat room. But Mike writes, we should review Bishop Gene Robertson's words, and I think this is interesting to your comment here. It just went away. Hang on, let me bring it back up. It's funny, isn't it, that you can preach a judgmental and vengeful and angry God and nobody will mind. But if you start preaching a God that's too accepting, too loving, too forgiving, too merciful, too kind, then you're in trouble. I think that's a pretty true narrative. Now, I'm in worlds where you don't get to preach an angry God.
I was just gonna say, I think it depends on your worlds, right? If
On
I
your
preach an
worlds, yeah.
angry God, people are gonna be like, "Oh, that's far too angry. That's too angry of a God. Where's my loving, cuddly God?" I'm
Yes.
like, well,
Yeah, but there's
I
others,
will
right,
say that
who
was a great profile picture
oh yeah.
that he had.
Yes, for Mike the Eagle with the hat on. Mike Dumfrey, well played, my friend. But there is something, right, where like again, we just have this notion that it's almost like the book of Ecclesiastes kicks in when you're talking about kindness, like everything in moderation. Just a little bit of kindness is good. Sprinkle it on,
Yeah.
like
Don't go wild with the kindness. Don't go too
don't
far.
don't go too far. And I
And
think
I,
we should probably push a little further than most of
and
us
I
than
do
most of
think
us
you're
have.
right in that at the end of the day, we value strength and power.
Mm-hmm.
And so when the work it gets too difficult to keep committed to kindness and humanity, it's much easier to say, let's just take this outside. Right. I mean, I
Yeah.
think that just is an easier and default. Like I'm not a big like original sin kind of person, but I think there is
Mm-hmm.
something in sometimes that we just gravitate towards power over. And I think
Yeah.
that's a message that's been shared through traditions and everything. And as opposed to power with is a much more, I think, expansive way of seeing the world. But when it gets difficult, it's power over. Who wins? I'm going to make sure it's me. And so, and I don't want to be on the losing side because you know what that means. So I think that's part of it is we have to challenge ourselves not to fall back into that space because it feels like we're going to get taken advantage of. And I think sometimes, well, that certainly could happen. I think sometimes we need to push further through
Hmm.
to give transformation a little more chance of happening. And it's a long. I mean, like Martin Luther King says, it's a long arc, but I think it's a journey worth committing to.
Hmm. There's this old story that I don't even know if it's true, but I remember it being told it when I was young. So it's this little narrative that there was a professional golfer and he won a golf tournament, $5,000 or something like that, and received a check. And a woman met him in the parking lot and came up and said, "Look, my son's in the hospital. I can't pay for him to stay another day. I don't have insurance. I need some money." And the guy signs over this $5,000 check to her and gives it to her. And the next week, there's another golf tournament, and these are not the professional, but not the PGA ones. So it's sort of in the same area. And some of the people who run that golf tournament came up and said, "Hey, everybody, you need to be careful. There's a person that's been coming up to people in the parking lots, and she's defrauding people by saying that her son's in the hospital and is asking for the money." So, and apparently this person was asked or said "Yeah, I ran into her last week and gave her my $5,000 check." And they said, "Well, how do you feel the fact that, she took advantage of you?" And he said, "So you're telling me that there's a boy who's not in the hospital or not is not being kicked out of the hospital?" And she said, "Yeah, that was a fraud. That wasn't true." He said, "Well, that's what I gave the money for, is so that a boy wouldn't get kicked out of the hospital. So I guess that's how it went." Right. His attitude was, "I was being kind. The
Yeah.
outcome of that is not on me. My obligation for my kindness ended. If she's defrauding people, she's defrauding people. But that's where my obligation ended." And it came to mind when you said this idea about power over. Sometimes kindness can even be seen as an action that's transactional, right?
Mhm.
If I'm kind, then I will receive something. It will function in a way. And there's another kind of kindness which doesn't extend itself past the act of kindness, right?
Yeah.
It's only within your arm's reach, and you're not going down the road further.
Yeah. I mean, I see the same thing, when we make kindness or our relationships transactional, I think we've just stepped down a path that's difficult to get out of.
Mm.
I think, for instance, there's folks when I say thank you, you're supposed to say you're welcome. That's the rule. Those are the rules.
Yes.
Well, then why are you saying thank you?
Yes.
Because you want to be acknowledged that you said thank you, or are
Yeah.
you genuinely grateful for whatever just happened? So I don't actually care if another person says to me, "You're welcome." I'm like, "No, I just actually wanted to express my
Yeah.
thanks."
Yeah.
I didn't expect, and I know it angers some people, and I don't know how generational it is or what it is, but I think some folks, I've seen people say thank you and then look as if,
Yep. Let's finish the circle.
yeah, I'm like, so you're not really, you want to be acknowledged for something that you did that you think is good. You want them to acknowledge you. Thank you for
Nice.
thanking me. I'm like,
Yeah.
that's not really being thankful then, is it? Like,
Yeah. It's like
that's
they stuck
just,
their hand up for a high five and they left you hanging there and they're like,
yeah,
hey,
exactly. I'm
if
like,
I put
well,
my
yeah,
hand up, you slap it.
yeah, these are the rules, and you just broke the rule. And I'm like, well, that's a dumb rule. Like,
Mhm.
just, I say thank you because I'm actually thankful for whatever just happened, not because I
Yes.
want you to then thank me for being thankful to you. I mean, it's just, yeah.
Yeah, the transactionalism in so many things, we carry it into our relationships, into our businesses, into our faith. A lot of people live a transactional relationship with God. They really believe this is how it works. It's, whether it's a judgeful eye of God or a karma narrative or something where, like, look, everything I'm doing is investing so that something comes back. And that is so ingrained. And when you live in a world that's full of transactional narratives, then you have to run an economy scale. Like, what's the economic exchange that I get here?
Yep.
You're traveling to Canada and you're going to exchange dollars for Canadian dollars, and
What is
you're
Canadian
wondering.
kindness to U.S. kindness?
It's over the top. Those
It's,
people. I mean, you can't afford it. They just give it away. Canadians are just, well, at least the nicest and the kindest people. Um, so yeah, you can't afford to buy that kind of. But this transactional thing is a real problem, and it shows up in all the areas. And I really hope that your book helps people find out that, look, there's a alternative to that transactional world, which really is kindness. Kindness doesn't have to play
yeah,
by all those rules. All right, so the book,
yeah.
friends, is In Defense of Kindness: Why It Matters, How It Changes Our Lives, and How It Could Save the World, by Bruce Reyes-Chow. Bruce, I haven't even told people what you do, and you haven't told them what you do yet. Do you want to say a little bit about where people can find you
I,
in person when that's available and online?
Yeah,
And
I wish I always knew what I do. So, like many of us, I do quite a few things, but I'm
Mhm.
mainly the pastor at First Presbyterian Church of Palo Alto. We're both in person and online, and we'll continue to have that expression. As I like to say in our circles, like, we're a legit social justice church, and I'm thrilled to be serving these folks. And they're part-time, and then I do some writing and speaking and all the other kind of fun things that
Mhm.
they get to do. And I can be found on all the socials at B Reyes Chow, and I'm mostly active on Instagram and Twitter and a little bit on Facebook. But
Mhm.
B Reyes Chow on all the things. I'm the only Reyes-Chow in the world, and so when people tell me I couldn't find you, I'm always like, well, did you really look that hard? So yeah.
Yeah, did you spell yes
Yeah,
for
exactly. Like,
Reyes? Yeah,
even
good.
then, I'm sure I come up. You just
Sure
got to
you
get
come
the
up.
S and the hyphen C. I'm probably gonna come up.
Well, I looked your book up on Amazon, and as soon as I typed Bruce R, the first thing that popped up was Bruce Reyes-Chow. So well done, my friend. Hey, pick up the book, y'all, and enjoy it. Bruce, thanks for being with us here on the Vote Common Good podcast. And friends, just remember that this podcast is available if you're watching us live here or watching us on a recording on Facebook, Twitch, YouTube, those places, Twitter. Know that you can get the audio version of all of our stuff over votecommongood.com/podcast, or of course all the places where you get podcasts. And if you're only a podcast listener, thanks for listening on the podcast, and send us a note sometime at podcast@votecommongood.com and let us know where you listen and what you're up to, and like all the places and share it with your friends if you would. We really appreciate it. So we'll see you tomorrow. It's Science Day. We're going to be talking about the tyranny of merit in our economic system, because we talk science and economics on Friday. So we'll see you then. And then Monday, we're back with news roundups. Tuesday, politics. Wednesday, our faith day with 4 faith leaders. And then Thursday, we talk about ideas that change the world. So Bruce, thanks so much for being with us today and being our guest, and all the best to you in the book.
Thanks for having me.